According to the Economic Policy Institute, the value of the federal minimum wage is now at its lowest point in 66 years, earning nearly 50% less in inflation-adjusted wages than a minimum wage worker in 1968, and with nearly half of all full-time workers not even earning a living wage. How can the richest country in the world allow full-time workers to be unable to afford the basic costs of living? While the debate over raising the minimum wage has become a constant point of political division, used to rally voters, spark outrage, and signal ideological values, politicians and corporate leaders have failed to address the simple fact that the dollar has lost 33% of its value in the 16 years since the wage was last raised to $7.25. And with no meaningful adjustments, these same cycles of wage stagnation that have existed since the earliest chapters of America's labor struggles continue to repeat. Following the United States' independence from Britain, the Industrial Revolution created an urgent demand to build a strong domestic manufacturing base capable of competing with England. And unlike Europe, which had seen the earliest forms of labor unions, typically known as guilds, the abundance of land and scarcity of labor in America meant that hard work often yielded significant increases in personal wealth, which gave rise to a culture that not only rejected collective labor structures, but the very idea of external assistance, casting it as a personal failure rather than a structural necessity, where the absence of any regulations around wages or working conditions led Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton in a 1791 report to suggest that children who would otherwise be idle could serve as a source of cheap labor, laying the groundwork of a labor system that would fundamentally prioritize cheap productivity over the very people making it possible. Where by 1904, 25% of all mill workers were children, with almost half being under the age of 12. Resulting in the first major legislative battle over child labor taking place in North Carolina, where reformers fought to raise the minimum working age for girls and illiterate children from 12 to 14. And while the bill was initially expected to pass with broad support from the state's elected officials, it was ultimately defeated after the president of the Cotton Manufacturers Association declared that if a minimum age law passed, every mill in the state would be forced to shut down, resulting in the bill failing to receive a single vote in the North Carolina legislature. In 1906, a federal child labor bill was introduced in Congress by Republicans seeking to outlaw the transport of goods mined or manufactured by children under the age of 14, stating, "We cannot permit any man or corporation to stunt the bodies, minds, and souls of American children. We cannot thus wreck the future of the American Republic." But once again, the bill was defeated, this time after the chairman of the National Association of Manufacturers dismissed it as a labor union plot against the advancement and the happiness of the American boy, calling it a threat to industrial prosperity. Opponents claimed that most children were destined for factory work and argued that banning child labor would only rob them of the chance to develop good industrial habits. One critic even lamented, "It is a tragic thing to contemplate if the federal government closes the doors of the factories and you send that little child back, empty-handed, that brave little boy that was looking forward to get money for his mother for something to eat." However, these so-called good industrial habits were only expected of poor children, as the concern about idle use did not appear to be one shared by the upper classes, with one well-to-do father explaining, "We work for our children, plan for them, spend money on them, buy life insurance for their protection, and some of us even save money for them." But at the lower end of the income scale, families were forced to use their children for labor, without the luxury of saving for their futures. With an analysis of Philadelphia families finding that for native-born, two-parent households, children contributed between 28 and 33% of total income. For Irish and German families, those numbers rose as high as 46 and 35%, forcing both families and children to be largely opposed to child labor reforms, not because they supported exploitation, but because they had no other option, and hadn't yet realized that the real problem was not the need for child labor. It was that adult wages were not enough to survive on in the first place. Where it wasn't until the worst economic crisis in modern history that this illusion finally collapsed, as youth unemployment reached as high as 60% in many urban areas, leaving children who had once helped support their families to be unable to ease the financial burdens at home. And with an estimated 78% of Americans living below the poverty line, it became clear that without societal safety nets or job protections, the working class would continue to carry the full weight of a system that prioritized cheap productivity over the very people making it possible, resulting in the nation turning to Franklin D. Roosevelt and the New Deal to help redefine how the economy should serve its people. Following his election, Franklin D. Roosevelt appointed Frances Perkins as Secretary of Labor in 1933, making it clear that she would only accept if she could push for a national law that would put a floor under wages, a ceiling over hours, and eliminated the worst abuses of child labor, highlighting that, in my opinion, one of the biggest obstacles that we face is the simple fact that we have completely lost sight of what the minimum wage is intended to do. In a 1933 speech on the National Industrial Recovery Act, Roosevelt stated, "In my inaugural, I laid down the simple proposition that nobody is going to starve in this country. It seems to me to be equally plain that no business, which depends for existence on paying less than living wages to its workers, has any right to continue in this country. By business, I mean the whole of commerce as well as the whole of industry. By workers, I mean all workers, the white-collar class as well as the men in overalls. And by living wages, I mean more than a bare substance level. I mean the wages of decent living," reinforcing that the minimum wage wasn't just a policy floor. It was meant to provide a livable income. But despite national support, Southern lawmakers warned that a federal workweek and minimum wage would destroy their industries, claiming the proposed 40 cents, equivalent to $9.04 a day, would force mass layoffs. As Representative John McClellan of Arkansas asked, what profits the laborer of the South if he gained the enactment of a wage and hour law, 40 cents per hour and 40 hours a week, if he then lose the opportunity to work, resulting in the bill to be revised to lower its first-year minimum wage to 25 cents an hour, equivalent to $5.65 today, to meet Southern opposition. And just hours before the final vote, Roosevelt reinforced the urgency of the legislation in a national fireside chat.
After many requests on my part, the Congress passed a Fair Labor Standards Act, what we call the Wages and Hours Bill. That act, applying to products in interstate commerce, ends child labor, sets a floor below wages, and a ceiling over the hours of labor. Except perhaps for the Social Security Act, it is the most far-reaching program, the most far-sighted program for the benefit of workers that has ever been adopted, here or in any other country. Without question, it starts us towards a better standard of living and increases purchasing power to buy the products of farm and of factory. Do not let any calamity-howling executive with an income of $1,000 a day, who has been turning his employees over to the government relief rolls in order to preserve his company's undistributed reserves, tell you, using his stockholders' money to pay the postage for his personal opinions, tell you that a wage of $11 a week is going to have a disastrous effect on all American industry.
Creating for the first time a labor market structure where the industrial productivity no longer came entirely at the expense of the people making it possible. Where over the next 30 years, the federal minimum wage was increased 8 times, allowing a minimum wage worker to afford an entire month's rent with less than a week and a half of full-time work at 75 cents an hour in 1950, or $10.24 a day. By 1956, when the wage officially hit $1, or $11.77 today, it provided enough to support a 2-person household above the poverty line, as it remained largely tied to both inflation and productivity, until peaking at $1.60 in 1968, or roughly $15.05 today. But despite 6 additional increases during the 1970s, it still failed to keep up with runaway inflation. And rather than addressing the massive spending on the Vietnam War, the Federal Reserve's loose monetary policy, or the abandonment of the gold standard, political and corporate leaders instead blamed the working man's extravagant wage demands as the real cause of inflation, tying the rapid minimum wage increases as one of the main catalysts to why inflation was increasing, where as a result, the federal minimum wage was frozen for the entirety of Ronald Reagan's presidency, with Reagan himself declaring, "The minimum wage has caused more misery and unemployment than anything since the Great Depression," where the 1980s also saw a renewed push for a youth sub-minimum wage, on the grounds that lower rates would help make them more employable and help break the chain of poverty in inner cities. However, a 1980 Washington Post article, McDonald's Minimum Wage Break, revealed that food franchises had pumped over $400,000, or roughly $1.6 million today, into congressional races, with much of the money directed at key House and Senate committees, with McDonald's and Steak and Ale PACs alone contributing roughly $863,000 today, more than both Exxon and Ford. And when the sub-minimum discussion came up for debate, McDonald's became the most visible lobbyist for the measure, even sending supporters to Capitol Hill in McDonald's jackets. As proposals suggested, teens would be paid 85% of the minimum wage, which would have created an after-tax savings of 31 cents per share for McDonald's in 1982, or a projected 10 to 15% bump in its stock price. And while the measure didn't pass under Reagan, a training wage was later added to the Fair Labor Standards Act in 1989, allowing workers under the age of 20 to be paid 85% of the minimum wage for their first 90 days. That same year, McDonald's stock rose by 44%. Simultaneously, globalization and automation were eliminating middle-income jobs at an unprecedented rate, leading the nation to prioritize a college education as the guaranteed path to the economic security that a white-collar job would provide, while forcing high school graduates to rely on the only job still available, emerging low-wage, low-income service work, allowing companies like McDonald's to not only expand globally, but increasingly fill the domestic job market void, where 12.5 million of the 16.1 million jobs created under Reagan's presidency were concentrated in sectors like waitstaff, janitorial services, and retail, resulting in wages for young men to fall from $12.19 in 1979 to $8.72 in 1995, while wages for young women dropped from $9.01 to $7.43, even as the dollar lost 52.4% of its value during that same time period, proving that despite wages actually decreasing, the cost of living was continuing to rise. And as the narrative surrounding the minimum wage remained deeply divided, especially throughout the early 1990s under President George H.W. Bush, it wasn't until New Jersey raised its state minimum wage from $4.25 to $5.05 in 1992 that economists David Card and Alan Kruger conducted what would become one of the most widely cited and controversial studies in labor economics. Card, who would later win the 2021 Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences, and Kruger, who would go on to serve as an Assistant Secretary of Treasury and chair of the White House Council of Economic Advisors, tracked over 400 fast food restaurants across New Jersey and Pennsylvania, where contrary to traditional economic theory, they found no evidence that the wage hike reduced employment. In fact, the stores that had been paying the lowest wages beforehand actually experienced the largest job gains. And while the minimum wage rose by 18%, they found the cost burden was largely not absorbed by consumers, with prices increasing just 4%, far less than had previously been expected. It also did not slow job creation, as McDonald's openings actually increased in several states with higher minimum wages, reinforcing that broader economic forces were far more influential than modest changes in labor costs, where these findings helped push President Bill Clinton to raise the federal minimum wage by 90 cents between 1996 and 1997, or roughly $1.87 today, calling it a chance for 10 million workers to raise stronger families and build better futures. However, between 1994 and 2001, over 879,000 middle-income jobs were officially certified as lost to direct trade competition under the U.S. government's Trade Adjustment Assistance Program, with some economists estimating that the real number was 2 to 3 times higher. And while the creation of 22 million jobs made for a compelling headline, it's estimated that between 40 and 45% of the jobs created under Bill Clinton were concentrated in low-wage, low-skill service work, repeating the same cycle of a labor market fundamentally dependent on cheap labor over the standard of living for the very people making it possible. Where since President Bill Clinton's last increase to the federal minimum wage, it has only been adjusted 3 additional times, with the last adjustment raising it to $7.25 on July 24, 2009, marking this the longest period without an increase since its inception in 1938. And just for comparison, to prove how stagnated this has become, using our same example of a 1950 minimum wage worker earning 75 cents an hour, or $10.25 today, being able to afford an entire month's rent with less than a week and a half of full-time work, when accounting for the average rent in the United States sitting at $1,623 a month, a minimum wage worker would need to work 224 hours, or roughly 5.6 weeks, just to be able to afford a single month of rent, while the average American worker would need to earn $27.05 per hour, or roughly $56,264 a year, just to pay rent with a week and a half of full-time work. And yet, 62% of the workforce makes less than $27 an hour. And when comparing a minimum wage worker earning $1 in 1956, or $11.77 today, that provided enough income to support a 2-person household above the poverty line, the annual earnings of a single adult working full-time year-round at $7.25 an hour now actually falls $570 below the poverty threshold of $15,650. And while the nation is unbelievably divided on the student loan crisis, if we consider that even during the 1980s, throughout all of the deregulation and corporate upheaval, in 1989, tuition, fees, and room and board at a four-year state university cost $4,274, or $11,138 when adjusted for inflation, where a student earning a minimum wage of $3.35 in 1989, or $8.73 today, could cover a year's tuition with 1,276 hours of work. Today, with the average cost of attendance at a public university being $27,146 a year, that same student would need to work 3,744 hours at the federal minimum wage of $7.25, nearly triple the time required in 1989. Even at $15 an hour, it would still take 1,810 hours, or to be able to pay off the cost of college the same way a minimum wage worker could do in 1989, you would have to make $21.27 an hour, with nearly 40% of the entire American workforce making less than $22 an hour. And when accounting for the fact that only about 869,000 workers in the United States actually earn wages at or below the federal minimum wage, or roughly 1.1% of the workforce, when considering that minimum wage was intended to provide a living wage, roughly 44% of all full-time U.S. workers are not achieving that, effectively resulting in half of the entire American workforce making less than what the minimum wage would have been if it had remained tied to worker productivity. Which leads me to believe that the real reason the minimum wage has not been increased is due to the simple fact that if there was a genuine national push to get the minimum wage to a point to where it was somewhat competitive with the standard cost of living, it would force the nation to get off the hamster wheel of hoping maybe I'll get a promotion, maybe I'll get a raise. I hope that this Christmas bonus is going to be worth my while. Maybe the lucky lottery ticket's going to pay off. I hope that the stock that my neighbor recommended to me is going to push me through to retirement. And realize that I'm not making enough money. I am not making enough money to be able to combat inflation and the rising cost of living. It's easy to say, to point fingers at minimum wage. It's easy to have the narrative be controlled when you see somebody say minimum wage should be $50, because emotionally you get so triggered wanting to combat that. And then you have this narrative of, oh, but the small business. Oh, but the low income workers, if you actually lower minimum wage, you'll actually have more people be able to work so they can get those experiences. Those experiences that unfortunately mean nothing in today's labor market, that literally actually lead you to getting less job prospects, because in the recruiter's eyes, if you're working a service level job, it signals class. I've said that many, many times. It's insane that is the system that we're a part of, but that's what's happening. And it's just absurd that we're going to talk about small businesses when, as a nation, we do nothing for small businesses. We talk about it and we have this poster about it, but we are a country that caters to big business and to people that already have money. Nobody else really matters. And we have to realize that. Right before I left, I had this older couple, looked just like Winnie the Pooh and Piglet. And I don't know if I'm supposed to say that, but that's what they did. And he sounded just like Winnie the Pooh. They walk in and I'm talking with them, trying to figure out what it is that they needed help with. And come to find out that she had gotten sick. And so their retirement savings decimated, completely decimated, to be able to give her a fighting chance at life. And he ended up having to get a job working as a cashier at like a grocery store / gas station, making minimum wage. And you start talking to this older couple, maybe 75, 78 years old, and he just starts crying, and he's asking for help. He says, I just need help, because the one thing that my wife and I used to do, and it was our favorite thing to do, was drive throughout the hill country and to be able to listen to our favorite music. And I can't do that now because I can't afford gas. Because the Social Security payments I'm getting and the minimum wage check is not enough to pay for her medical expenses and the cost of living. And so imagine now, put yourself in my shoes. Or if you're a 40-year-old father, imagine your father telling your son, I need help. I'm not making enough money. If you're my age, 25 years old, imagine your grandfather coming to you with your grandmothers, crying, saying, I need help. I'm not making enough money. I'm doing the minimum wage of the United States, and it isn't enough. On top of Social Security. And to be whatever age I was, 21, I think, 22, to be that age, there was nothing I could do. Nothing. But I ended up going that next level. And so then I print out the transaction history, and we spend like 30 minutes going through every single one. And I find 4 automatic charges that they could get rid of. And I said, please do that because you'll be able to afford the cost of gas to be able to do your trips. Here is my card. Please call if you ever need my help. I'm always here to help. They leave. A couple days later, they come back. No call, unfortunately. And they walk into my manager's cubicle because I was busy. And my manager quickly gets upset and raises his voice and says, we do not make budgets here. You have to talk to a financial advisor. And so they go and they sit back in the lobby. And I just briefly come out to them and I say, hey, I'm sorry. I'm totally booked today. Please give me a call. I'm more than welcome to help you tomorrow or the next day. And they never come back. I wasn't able to help a 75, 78-year-old couple because what options do we have right now? Like sometimes it shocks me how when you look up blue collar jobs on YouTube, I am the guy. You look up what's going to now be minimum wage. Me and this other creator named Fads, which I definitely recommend you watch his video. We're the 2 that have done minimum wage discussions within the past couple of years. When you look up ghost jobs, LinkedIn, some of these other topics, besides CNBC, I am the guy talking about it. And I'm so grateful to be able to do so. But where are the people that are actually supposed to be making the difference? I don't know. I'm now risking this feeling like I'm whining. So ultimately, I hope that this video provided value. And yeah. I think it's important to think about that people do need help and that you can't just pick yourself up by your bootstraps every time. Until next time, bye-bye.